Hello and welcome to our Kaleidoscope Live. We are the Kaleidoscope team from the British Journal of Psychiatry. And as you may know, if you've been here before, each month we take some research that we've taken from our column in the BJ Psych, and we dissect it a bit more and talk about what we find interesting. Now, if you've been here before and you are observant, you may notice there is ordinarily 4 of us here, and we only have 3 today. It's a bit like the Beatles without Ringo Starr. We have all the talent in the room, even if it's not quite the same. And we're going to do some sex, drugs, and rock and roll this month. We're at least going to do the sex and drugs. The rock and roll is normally Dan Joyce, but he has better things to do, apparently. It's not quite true. He sends his apologies, but, it's not good enough. Anyway, I'm going to start talking about a study on drugs, on illicit drugs that I found really interesting. And the topic is microdosing, which you might have heard of before. So microdosing is where people take lower dose of a standard dose of an illegal drug. The classic is with psychedelic medications or psychedelic drugs, and they use it for creative or therapeutic gain. And so the idea really interested me for lots of reasons. So some of it is the background of some changes in society, some changes in drug laws, some changes in science. And we've discussed this on previous episodes, so we can think about things like ketamine, psilocybin, MDMA. There's interest in some of these drugs that people have used illicitly, and maybe they have therapeutic roles for people, because it's certainly something people have said over time. So why do people take drugs? So sometimes maybe they take it to feel better, or they report that it helps them in their life. But it's typically been outside scientific areas. And there are reasons for that, and they include legislation. So it's often quite difficult to do science when it's to do with illegal drugs. And I think there's probably also social reasons. So if we think about drugs in society, I think we're seeing shifts now. So beforehand, maybe there were far more societal pushes against drug use, and illicit drug use is seen more from a criminal viewpoint or something that was bad. And I think we're seeing society change. So you can see it if you're in London at the moment, the current mayor is talking about potentially looking at decriminalising cannabis. I'm not suggesting that's a reason to vote for Steve Khan or that I would vote for him. Certainly wouldn't vote for any of the other people who are going up for election. And of course, the other thing that we've got to think about too is the challenge of mental health is there's a real need for new treatments too. So we know about the burden of mental ill health or mental well-being, and that there's a need for new treatments. So this study, let's come on to this one. This is Sukhi et al. It's a team at Imperial, and a lot of the guys at Imperial are doing some of the leading work in terms of the possible repurposing of illicit drugs. And it's a paper from the online journal eLife. So again, they were looking at microdosing of psychedelics, so where people are taking a smaller dose to enhance their well-being. And where you may have seen microdosing before, where I came across it in the first instance was from California and creative industries. So people who were working in the arts were taking it and saying that it enhanced their well-being and their creative abilities. What I found really interesting, we might come back to some of the methodology later on. I mean, it's an interesting study for lots of reasons, but one of which for me was what the authors call citizen science. So it's quite hard to do research on people taking drugs because it's illegal activity and people might be concerned about it. But the authors recruited almost 200 people who were already doing this, right? So they're microdosing and saying, I take low dose psychedelics because I think it helps my well-being. So that's kind of interesting. They recruit them that way. But here's the second thing that I think they did that was really interesting. They managed to introduce a placebo element. And this has been part of the big pushback against the literature on illicit drug use, because there isn't a randomized control group ordinarily, and scientists like randomized control groups. So if I take a drug, how do I know it's really the drug that's making me feel better, and how would I compare it? So what they did was really interesting, was a 4-week design. They said to participants, take the drug you ordinarily microdose with and the dose you ordinarily microdose with. Now, already we're introducing challenges here. This is what a person normally takes. And the way they randomized them was the scientists gave them these non-transparent capsules. So the pill you swallow, you can't see through it. Half of them, they had to put in the drug they normally microdose with, and half were left with nothing in it. So now the individuals have their own placebo-controlled trial. They've got the active microdose and they have empty ones. and they put them into envelopes, and the envelopes had, those QR codes where you can scan with your phone. So the individuals then couldn't tell which ones are which, but the research team could. So the research team knew which envelopes contained the active drug, which the person normally takes, their drug of choice, their dose of choice. And the research team knew which ones were placebo, but the person didn't. And we've almost 200 people here. And then they randomized into 3 groups. Group 1, they only get the placebo. So they're told, get QR code, whatever it is, ABC, and they take those ones, and the research team know they're taking the placebo. The second group, it was mixed. They had half placebo, half 2 weeks of placebo, 2 weeks of microdosing, and the microdosing was twice per week. So again, you might want to argue about how often should people take it. And the third group had 4 weeks of only getting the microdosing. So twice a week, they got their drug that they would ordinarily take. And then the research team measured their well-being. So what was really, really interesting with it, all groups showed an improvement in their well-being. But the key part is there was no difference between them. Those on the microdosing psychedelic showed no gain over those on placebo. And so the really interesting finding is the authors suggest microdosing isn't working as people think. It's showing some gain. The gain is placebo. So this research really, really interested me. Again, it interested me. The topic's really interesting. It's really, really topical. I thought it was methodologically really interesting what they did and how they designed it, although you could critique it. And then, of course, what was fascinating for me is it pours some caution on the field, because what I find really interesting is I get the drivers. I get the need for something new, but here's some caution from science saying maybe we need to think a bit more about what we're doing. So that was what fascinated me. What about you two? What were your thoughts on this trial?
I had lots of thoughts, and they don't land squarely in any one place, actually. I responded in lots of different ways, I think really similarly to you. The first thing, obviously, that piqued me was the citizen science aspect. And I think it's because I can recall kind of very early days, now, 20-something years ago, when something called Foldit basically gamified and created a citizen science arm for trying to figure out the best tertiary folding for protein and protein binding. And it was really successful, and it still kind of exists to this day. But there's been so many other uses of kind of not just sort of the scale of using citizens, because you can get a bunch of people to look for particular types of birds or bugs, kind of naturalistic observations, or you can get this kind of almost specialist volunteering of time from a smaller group of people. So like the protein structure folding, or it's been used in maths theorems and some decoding stuff. And so you can see the real, not just the power in terms of the scale and the recruitment of expertise outside of your budget, but you can see the appeal in terms of, as a citizen, being a part of science is exciting, and probably from a PR perspective does a lot of good for what we do, kind of breaking those barriers down. And I know there'll be a cynical take as well, that it kind of maybe muddies the water, if you will. But with that said, I think it's interesting, and I think it kind of goes along with what's happening in modern science in terms of the sort of open science. Let's open it up. Like, we're literally going to send you some capsules and some QR codes, and we're going to teach you about, blinding and have you be a part of it. So in that way, I think there's something intriguing. The drug aspect itself, of course, is instantly controversial, not just because of the pharmaceutical substance, but because of the lore, the laws, all of that. And as a scientist, I get a little twitchy when we're making conclusions based around whatever thing you like to microdose at whatever dose you like to microdose. So for me, that feels a little bit uncomfortable. Now, with that said, that probably guarantees a sensitivity, which is why their kind of break blind rate is high, because people are going to taper up until they can kind of feel it, and so would be able to guess more likely than not that it was in fact the case. But in terms of conclusions, I walked away sort of confused and really looking forward to talking with you guys about it, because I'm not sure what we know coming away from this. I mean, I get what the conclusions are, and I get all of that, but like, what does it mean? ultimately, we know that people who microdose are pretty good at detecting that they've got it in the system. Okay, good. And that everybody feels better for doing it. Whether or not there's actually a pharmacological reason for it is still unclear. But anybody who's been around any kind of pharmacology for any amount of time knows that a placebo effect is still an effect. And if it's moving towards well-being and towards health, my version could be hoarding plants, right? Making baked goods. And maybe this is their version. And in that way, is that not a net gain? I don't know. I walked away a little bit befuddled. So please come in, help illuminate.
I'm not sure that it's going to be that illuminating, but the things that struck me about the paper were really the fact that their conclusion was that belief, or what you're describing as the placebo effect, was a significant driver in both physiological and psychological change. So that's, I mean, we kind of know that the placebo response works. I guess now you've shown that it can work at microdose levels as well. So I thought that's interesting. If it was true that actually microdosing is based just on how strong your belief is that you will benefit from taking this, then in effect, as long as you're not doing any harm, then I guess you will benefit from that. And so there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy with the people who are doing that. So I thought scientifically it was tricky to actually, I think I agree with you, it's really difficult to draw any firm conclusions given the fact you didn't actually know what people were taking. And so I kind of think if you're looking for a cheap, quick way of improving it, would have been really nice to have, when they were splitting the samples up, just to have one sample that could be sent to these folk just for testing. And I don't know whether that's legal or illegal to ship it in the post, but at least just being able to verify that in the active arm, you were having some psychoactive substance at some dose would have been really helpful. Given the fact that if you just go and presumably if you just go and buy illicit drugs from somewhere, the quality control is often not great. And certainly some of the surveys, I mean, the kind of best data, I think, suggests that maybe like 70% of what you buy might contain something that you think is in there, but that still leaves quite a considerable amount of variation in the other 30% where we've got no idea what's there. And some of it may be psychoactive, but just in a very different way. So whether it just contains a bit of antidepressant or barbiturate or whatever is available, we've got no idea. The second bit is really that there's a big push towards something called decentralized clinical trials. So the idea is our kind of traditional model, if you've got a drug, we can stick with the same example. If microdosing is really helpful towards creativity and well-being, then you might want to test that formally in a kind of randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. And this is a kind of naturalistic version of that. But if you wanted to do that, the attrition rates and the costs are just enormous. So, and lots of companies have put off those kind of costs, and those are regulatory costs because everything you do needs to be backed up. So if somebody wants to check that patient X took the placebo or not, it needs to be able to be verified because it's such an important thing to be able to license a drug. But that enormous cost and the fact that a lot of that is based around a site where somebody like Dan as a PI might be sitting there running these studies, and there are people who can do the testing and take the blood and do the placebo and have the pharmacy. All of those people are engaged in that process. And then you might have researchers who will then test people for their wellness or their physiological reaction as well. But it's relying on folk coming to this site to have all of this testing. And when they've looked at the kind of average distance that people travel, it's often like over an hour, sometimes 2 hours to kind of get there. And so one of the problems with any of these trials is just the dropout rates are really enormous. So does the idea of this citizen science thing is really following on in that zeitgeist of remote trials. So can we just get people to actually do all of the things that we need at home And how do we do that? And is that feasible? And it's becoming a much more, and there's an interest in it both from the logistic end, that if you're saying that if you want more people interested in research and clinical trials is one aspect of that, then it has to be patient-centered or person-centered. And there's nothing more person-centered than being able to do it in your own space, not having to go out. And if you can minimize the cost and the inconvenience of travel, then that's a phenomenal way of doing these things. So for me, this kind of was an illustration of how those decentralized trials might work, particularly as they're becoming, I think, going to be over the next few years, it's going to become a much more interesting area about how you're going to do that. And people really want to use technology. And in fact, I guess this is a really good example of how there may have been a time when people would have, the only way to access this conversation would have been to come to the IOP or come to Bath and sit in the lecture theatre and do that. And whereas now you can kind of see everybody and you can get it live or you can have it recorded. So this is an example of a kind of person-centered approach where you're bringing something to folk wherever they are. And so I think that extension of those kind of trials is going to be quite an interesting space, particularly as people are more and more interested in using kind of wearable technology and the phones and the things that they're doing. So rather than use very crude metrics of how you're sleeping on a questionnaire or how you feel on a particular time, you can actually do that live. People will record that themselves for you. You don't need to keep 2 weeks worth of memories and then come to the site and kind of spit them out to say, how have you been over the last 2 weeks? But that also raises a bunch of issues in terms of making sure, how can you deliver securely to people? And maybe one of the things that may come out of this pandemic thing is that, you know, I don't want to be contentious, but God forbid that Amazon is going to be offering those kind of services, but you want a reliable kind of courier service which can deliver and take samples and data in a secure way, which is regulated and noted, so that if you want to verify that at a later date during a trial, that's possible to do. So all of that technology seems to have advanced in leaps and bounds during these years of lockdown. And similarly, the security of this kind of conversation, there was a time, Derek will tell you, that we were unable to have patient conversations over online because of the security concerns without having like a dedicated camera and room to be able to do that. Whereas now the NHS has deemed that Microsoft Teams is secure enough to be able to have confidential patient-related conversations. So that transition is enormous. So I think that is coming one way or the other, and the ability to be able to interview somebody at home using this kind of technology, even for trials things, what would be the additional benefit of somebody coming to you is a little bit moot now. So I feel this is really pushing in towards an open door where I think more and more studies are going to be done in this rather interesting way.
Can I just jump in really quick? Because I love the accessibility of that. That changes who can participate. You get a better data set if you can make it easier for people to participate. And that gives you that sort of ecological validity, which I think that, you know, they definitely benefited from in this study, which is much less controlled than what you're talking about. But the idea being that, in fact, it is good to know what things look like in people's natural environment, how they respond in the natural environment. One question that I had walking away from this, and I just literally don't know the answer. What kind of, given that, you know, this sort of drug taking is illegal, I'm assuming, I know US laws, but we'll assume that it's illegal here too. What kind of liability is there for the researchers, even though these people are doing this anyway, right? I get it. And I'm sure they're saying, it's fine, I was going to do it anyway. But if there was an adverse event, given that this was an illegally acquired substance and illegally taken, what does that look like? That's a bit of a quagmire in my mind.
Yeah, I think that's that's probably less understood, and I think that's why this trial was able to proceed. It's people who are doing this anyway, in a sense, and you're trying to understand it. So I can understand the ethical argument that could be made in favor of it, because I was going to come back to that point, because it feels to me you guys are quite interested in the methodology, which is, these are the two interesting parts to me, but the methodology really interested you guys in the citizen science part. But the other part for me is actually about the drug itself. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of enthusiasm for psychedelics, and so that interested me because it feels to me a lot of people in this area are, there's a researcher allegiance and the people consuming them. So I would have loved to have seen microdosing in people who had never consumed it. But what struck me with that is then you're opening up ethical challenges, because then you have people who would not have otherwise consumed it. So in a sense, all you're doing is ordering the drug in someone who takes it anyway. And adding to that, if you're taking the microdosing to improve your health, I presume it tells us a couple of things. One is you feel there's something you need to treat, and that this is the way forward for you. So have people failed on antidepressants? Is it just they see different? It's a skewed cohort of people. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with anyone who's in the trial, but it's a group of people, and I wonder how that limits what we can generalize about it. I've worried a bit about the field of research in illicit drugs is that it has lacked randomized control trials. And one of the reasons I think microdosing was an attractive initial foray into this, because it's lower dose, it's easier to blind. You could still be breached. So there's a lot of research. So to turn this around, you might argue that maybe psychedelics do help our mental health, but microdosing is not the way to do it. In the same way, if I cut 10% of my antidepressant and take it, I don't expect to see an effect. And there's a lot of interest at the moment in research, so psychedelic guided psychotherapies and so forth. What's really hard there is it's very hard, or you might argue impossible, to blind a full dose psychedelic. These drugs are taken by people because they change how they think and feel. And so it gets into a realm where it gets harder and harder to do good science with it. I really would like to think there are more and more good treatments for any number of mental health conditions. I do wonder that the enthusiasm is exceeding the science. We have a paper, we're not going to discuss it here, it's going to be in June's Kaleidoscope, about smoked cannabis and PTSD, where they randomize it, and again, it's showing a negative finding. So I'm also, in terms of illicit drug research or non-typical drugs that are being used, I'm also interested in the research on this, because we need more science in it. So the methodology is interesting, but it's also the field is interesting. I just think enthusiasm is exceeding science.
I mean, the thing that I wanted to address was really, this has been approved, the study was approved by the Imperial Ethics Board. And the reason why it was approved was because I assume was because that people were taking something anyway. All you were asking them to do was actually not take it, or to have a variant of it that they were creating themselves. So if you were setting up a study, and you can imagine the complexity of it, they were going to offer this to naive folk. One thing that I can assure you of, there will be no shortage of volunteers. So whenever the university done studies involving illicit drugs, a lot of people just keen on and interested in what the effect might be from them. And it's also quite appealing, if you are going to do that, to do it in a safe environment where there's somebody to look after you if things don't go wrong. So actually it's a win-win, where you could try something new out, but actually it's unlikely that something terrible will happen to you. But actually just following on from that point about measuring, doing science in people who are already taking something, that in a way what the natural extension of this is that we have a kind of nationalized health service where each person is in contact with, GPs. And actually one thing which may benefit science and kind of offer individual level data, kind of inter-individual variability, would be if almost every drug that people take, that they could actually be able to report on whether it's beneficial, what the side effects are. So you could actually start using this kind of citizen science approach, but actually towards drugs which are already being prescribed. And at the moment, we don't have any metrics for those to see. We work on group level data from these clinical trials to say, if you give somebody who's depressed and we give them an antidepressant, or we use cognitive behavioral therapy or psychological therapy, we think 2/3 of those people will improve. But we don't know which 2/3 will improve. We don't know, and this leads on to our next paper, we don't know if it's more likely to be women or men or older people or younger people. Whereas this kind of citizen science approach, if you can get it to work, where you can collect data in individuals taking individual interventions, it gives you enormous power to be able to bring that data together and really understand differences. So I think the approach and the methodology is powerful.
I love that so much. That's very exciting. The idea that actually we should, of course, all be recording these things. You know, there's sort of this old adage that the final clinical trials when it's released, right, when it's finally available to the population. And this is where we see these rare side effects pop up. And if we were systematically collecting that data, oh man, that would be amazing. And what a wealth of information for the future. This is the kind of stuff that gets me really jazzed. You know, I would expect it in a Nordic country. They do this stuff all the time, but it would be so powerful. Yeah, what a great idea.
So that takes us nicely onto your paper then. So we've done drugs and we're on to the sex. I really liked that in May's Kaleidoscope, it opens with your quote that women are not just little men. I was 14 before I figured that out. And so that apparently makes a difference, right? What are you saying women are not just little men?
So to be fair, I have to give a shout out to the authors of this paper. So this was Rebecca Shansky and Anne Murphy, who wrote a perspective piece in Nature Neuroscience. And I happened upon it on International Women's Day, and it was just a cracking piece of writing. It was clean, it was surgical in its approach, it had recommendations, it was kind of all the things that I suppose were like swirling around in my head, but I had not actually put words to before. And it really helped land an idea that I didn't know I'd been wrestling with for a really long time. So yes, let's talk about the differences in gender. So I grew up in a period of time when there was this book that was quite famous called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. And it really established this idea that we are quite literally opposite species with totally different, particularly internal landscapes and motivations to be navigated, and that the other is like unknowable. And, you know, okay, so you've got these massive social and cultural implications to this idea. And frankly, the world responded, like people really latched onto that. Steve Harvey weirdly gets a talk show. Like it all became very strange socially, but people, the differences between us were something that everyone sat really comfortably with. Now, to be fair, of course, there are some big differences, right? Like, I can have a child, you cannot, right? Or at least not in the regular biological way. And so, yeah, sure, there are big differences. But if we look at what we know about human populations, it's that virtually everything actually plots out to a normal distribution. So we know that when we take a look overall, there's going to be lots of people at varying ends, and they're going to be quite different. And so when you look at subpopulations like men and women, the rule of thumb is that there's usually more variability within a subpopulation than there is between subpopulations. So you put all this together and you quite quickly realize that sex differences are both more and less important than we make them out to be. And so where does that leave us, right? What do we do with this? It's interesting if you look from a human development perspective, because actually female is the default, right? You actually require a pro-male signal to develop into male. Otherwise, it defaults to female. But you would never, ever know that looking at the way that somehow in modern health and medicine, we have made male the default in so many ways. And you can start by looking at just kind of textbooks. Medical textbooks use male bodies as the default human example for anatomy 3 times more than females. That follows up in terms of speaking on sex differences. And so you get this situation where, at least clinically, we are setting our trainees up with an unspoken idea about what is norm. We, of course, know that there are really kind of dire consequences for women in terms of diagnosis, side effects. They have worse health conditions and responses to treatments which are often just not designed for them. So we can see how this is all very set up in modern times. I think we all go, ooh, that's bad. And kind of where does that leave us? But where Rebecca and Anne came in here was to say, what does this look like in preclinical? So preclinical is when you're doing kind of animal studies. And this, I think, caught me because I don't know if you guys have done any kind of animal work before, but I have. And when I was starting, I worked in a male rat-only lab, and I remember asking about it. And the person who, to me, was literally my ambassador to science, the person who knew all the things and was going to tell me the way the world was, said, oh, we don't use females. There's too much error. and it was all kind of pinned to the estrus cycle. And I, of course, just swallowed that whole, like I was swallowing everything else. And looking back now, I'm outraged, absolutely outraged that somehow the basic biological function of what is more than half the world population is considered to be error in a system. So the idea that the male gaze is so strong, that orientation is so robust, that we would look at that as error and not something to be integrated, just goes to show kind of what we're up against here. So they pulled together just a really readable, clean progression through the ways in which we are really wrong and setting ourselves up for a continuation of failing women in health outcomes and understanding, and the ways in which it's not just this little difference between you and I here or there, but actually the systems and the incentivizing of continuing that way. So just to kind of quickly go around it, because I think it's worth reading on its own. But really, if you look at preclinical scientific studies, so rat studies usually, male rats are used 6 times more often than female rats. And it's so commonplace that hardly ever do you see a justification. Nobody even says, oh, the estrus cycle. Like, they just don't say anything. They're just like, here are my 24 male Sprague Dawley rats, enjoy. And, we are so numb to it. And again, what this does is set up all knowledge that comes from these processes as being default human, that the male is default human. So with that said, some funding organizations in Canada, US, and Europe pulled together something called the Sex as a Biological Variable mandate. And they required that if you're going to apply for funding, you need to include both male and female rats. Now, that's good. I like that. That's visible. It shows kind of a value system, which is great. It's non-binding, non-enforceable. You don't have to report on it at the end of the year. You don't even have to actually have the power to look at sex differences in your study. And you ultimately don't even have to analyze the data by sex. So it's a start, and that's super, but it is not enough. They go through some other reasons why this probably on its own is going to be a bit limp. But what I was most interested in was the way they looked at the power structure of science, and talking about how when in fact you are progressing with just male rats, you're able to have cleaner data, right? So you basically prevent yourself from having to deal with any messy differences, because if you found them, then you'd have to go chase them. And if you had to chase them, that would take you away from this line of thought that you were on, line of inquiry you were on in the beginning. The further you can get into that, the more likely you are to have enough data to create a complete story that will make you eligible for a really fancy publication in a high impact journal. That then could secure the career of your early career researcher or postdoc, make you look amazing as a mentor, and guarantee more funding so you can continue your work. So what these guys do is they basically say, right, okay, we recognize it's a problem enough to create a mandate around funding, which in the first 2 years only increased the number of submissions that had male and female rats by 3%, from 16 to 19%. But they're basically saying this has got to be a radical call to arms. And they do a super job of pulling apart in a box, like, here's all the reasons, the invalid reasons why this is cited as being acceptable. Here's how you break that down. Here are the ways in which we need to change the system. And they do such a good job of putting it on all of us, saying, actually, it's not just the scientists, it's not just the funders, it's not just the editors, it's the peer reviewers, and it's those of us who are working with people every day. We need to be questioning this and forcing a culture shift. Because quite literally, women's lives depend upon it. But even if you don't care about women's lives, your science is half as good if you're ignoring that part of the population. So what did you guys think?
Wow, I just feel like I need to take a bit of a breath after that.
It was an amazing paper.
I think there are a couple of things in the paper which I thought actually really struck me. One was exactly that last point that you made about power structures. is about how does it work. So, they talk a little bit about the National Institute of Health in the US, and they say 2/3 of the panel members who make decisions on research and what's going to be funded are male. And then they said, we also did, we've looked at the attitudes of these guys, and actually they don't think that it's that important to have gender balanced samples, which is like weird, right? Because you'd kind of think either there is a scientific value or there isn't. It's not really a matter of opinion, to be honest, right? And then, so I kind of think, and then the career progression thing was really striking, right? So it's essentially saying, if you want to be on a fast track to success in academia, you need to pretty much be on this kind of mono sex trials, because you're going to be introducing just a whole heap of trouble into your life. If it's going to be very difficult to power most studies to be able to look for sex differences. And they say that's not a problem. Actually, you should do it anyway. And then what it does is produce the fodder for your next examination. But if the prioritization is speed and excellence, and particularly about mechanism, then having an extra factor in your design is going to basically halve your productivity and half your timing. So if you want to go ahead twice as fast, it's much more efficient just to stick to male rats.
Twice as fast for half as much knowledge, though, right?
Yeah, no, but that's it. But the issue about, is an individual thing. It's about how fast you want your trajectory to be. So, of course, you would like to progress science, but actually you also need to pay the bills and get a mortgage and get a postdoc somewhere. So there's a kind of, they describe those tensions really well, that actually there is fundamentally a tension saying, ignore all of this sex as a biological variable thing. And then they also kind of make a point about how slow progress is going to be and the things that are likely to hinder it. And the positives in the paper are really just showing the value that if you do not look at this, you will not understand the disease. And they make a really cogent kind of case for that in a few areas, like pain response, that if you give opioids to male and female folk or rats, actually it's a different pathway and different receptors that are involved in the process. If you look at one of the most common models for what happens if you stress people either at an early developmental stage, they say you have these kind of classical findings that, you get hippocampal atrophy and dendrites are dropping off, and the same in the prefrontal cortex. And they make this case that actually, but if you look at that by gender, the differences are not the same. So, which is a really powerful and interesting effect. And then they go out of their way to say, actually, you can get to the same point in terms of functioning. So you may be impaired if you give a particular drug and everybody's impaired, both male and female, but the way you get there may be different, and that will impact on the intervention that you want to look at. And so I quite enjoyed they talked a little bit about the brain imaging kind of differences, and there's always been a kind of contentious view about, are there differences between men and women in terms of their brains, and what does that mean? And now, over the last, I think, few years, we've had enough large data sets to really say, yes, there are persistent differences which are gender related, particularly around some bits of the brain. And one of the interesting things that this paper kind of brought out, which I hadn't really thought about very much, was the fact that actually those differences that are observed in rats are seen also in humans, with the appropriate kind of movement of structures, particularly the structures that have been retained in an evolutionary manner. So I kind of thought that transition and the consistency of those findings, both in terms of brain structure and in terms of brain function, where that's translatable between rats and humans, was really phenomenally convincing. And you can see the effect of that, because we were responding to a review of a grant like 2 weeks ago. And one of the questions that's raised was, you're proposing to do neuroimaging or whatever we were doing in males, and because we've just followed this path without really thinking about it very critically, to think actually occasionally people might be pregnant and putting them in the scanner might be something that may be risky. So why take that chance has always been our mantra. So this is our own fault and our own stupidity. And now I said, actually, no, let's change the design. Actually, let's just say that we'll do, if necessary, we'll do a pregnancy test, but actually let's say we're going to affect change. And that's come out of reading this particular paper and being convinced by the argument that actually it's important that we do that. And the question that, the postdoc who's working with me asked me was exactly the same, but how won't we look a bit stupid that, originally we said we're going to power it for to look at one thing, and now we're going to add half women into the thing. And I said, well, sometimes it's not about looking stupid. It's actually trying to do the right thing and about actually doing the science. Once you become aware of something, you can't then ignore it. I think that's the worst thing to do than actually look a little bit stupid in the face of it. So that's a live example of what happens if you read things and they're well written and convincing, then it actually changes your approach.
I'm beaming. But you're right? When you know better, you do better. And that's awesome. It's an awesome example of how just an everyday decision, just on the fly, you will now change what we know, right? It makes a huge difference. It's tip of the hat, sir.
You guys leave me little to say, but that's okay because we're coming to the end of the podcast. I mean, I was struck by it too. The thing that kept coming to my head was that the kind of hashtag time's up enough, but I think it's got to be measured, and you got to show change. I've been reminded of recent conversations we've had in column and in these webinars, and we had one last month about measuring ethnicity. And unless you're showing about gender in terms of academic publications, so we know the BJ Psych measured the gender of the first and last author, and the journal has committed to continue to publish it because it's not good enough, and they will keep doing it until it gets to where it needs to be. And I think again that's where responsibility is at all different levels. Journals need to be doing this too. They need to be refusing to accept publications or asking for justification or showing their data. Grant bodies, research teams. I think hashtag time's up. Okay, I'm going to draw this to an end at this point. I hope you've enjoyed this month's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you guys next month.
Bye.
Bye.